What is the state of modern Christianity? I don't know how you would describe that. I'm not asking you to do it out loud. Maybe you've never thought about that. Maybe you have thought about it and you're still trying to figure it out. Maybe you have all the answers. If you do, see me afterwards and we'll schedule a couple of weeks so you can explain all the answers to me, because frankly, I don't have them. I look around at a world that is really confusing at times. I look around at a culture that we live in, and really here in modern 21st century America, we have a lot of benefits as citizens that a lot of other people around the world don't have. And I think sometimes we don't recognize that. I know there's a lot of debate about Christianity and culture, a lot of debate about how Christianity and culture fits together, even about our own nation. And I preached this morning to what is mostly, I presume, an American audience. We may have some people from other nations in here. Maybe you've become a naturalized citizen. Maybe you're still a temporary citizen or green card or student, something like that. I don't know what all we have here this morning, but predominantly we're people who most are familiar with the life that we live here in 21st century America. Some of you old enough to go back to 20th century America. Maybe you're pushing back to 19th century America. I don't know. Sometimes it seems like we live back there. And so we come, and there's a lot of cultural changes going on in our world, right? And frankly, there's a lot of them that we're not really quite sure about. We're not quite sure how to handle it. We're not quite sure what it means to be a Christian in a world that seems to be headed, what most of us probably think is the wrong direction. We're not quite sure what it looks like to live faithfully, because we have this view sometimes that America is the chosen nation of God, and God has blessed America, and God has given us, and all that was because America is a Christian nation, and all those people out there are trying to change it and trying to turn us around from that. Man, they're all messed up, and they're messing us up, and we're not quite sure what to do with that. And I think one of the things we've never really wrestled with, because of the way that we have lived for decades and perhaps centuries here, is we've never wrestled hard with what it means to be a Christian in an antagonistic culture. And we will not long have the luxury of living as a Christian apart from an antagonistic culture. Now let me say again what I've said often. You've heard me say this. I am not a Chicken Little Christian. You know Chicken Little, the guy who said the sky is falling, the sky is falling? And it turns out the sky wasn't actually falling. I'm not a guy who looks at the world around us and reads the newspapers as everything in the world is against Christians. Listen, we still have a tremendous amount of opportunity. We still have a tremendous amount of freedom. I don't know what the future looks like. I know a little bit about what the present looks like. But as we come to the Bible again today, one of the things that I think we need to wrestle seriously with is, what does it mean to radically follow God, to radically follow Christ in an antagonistic culture? Increasingly, we're going to face that. And we better be prepared for it. We've got to be prepared to face life in a world that is increasingly hostile towards God, increasingly hostile towards a moral framework in which things are declared to be right or wrong. And maybe you're here this morning, you're already tuning me out. You're looking for a way to gin up a cough so you can slip out the back and get out of here. Now it puts all the pressure on you. Leave. Everybody's going to know why you're leaving, right? But we come to Daniel this morning, a story in Daniel, and this may be the most familiar out of all the stories in Daniel. Daniel in the lion's den. That's where this ends. But before we get there, we got to do a little work in the text. And we got to see kind of the build up to this. Remember, Daniel had gone to this place called Babylon at about 16 years of age. All right, you think of a 16-year-old being ripped away from his family and his culture and everything he knew. Now, 16 back then probably wasn't 16 today. All right, life's changed. 16 back then probably wasn't consumed with playing video games for 16 hours a day and sleeping the other 8. But 16 back then was still pretty young. And he's ripped away from his culture, from everything he knows, and taken to a place where he doesn't even speak the language. He doesn't know anything about the cultural things, about the foods and the cultural habits and the things that they do there. And so to fix that problem, Nebuchadnezzar, all the way back in chapter 1 in 605 BC, tells his men under him, says, I want you, all these people that we brought over from Judah, I want you to pick the very best of them, and I want you to put them in school for 3 years. And in 3 years, you're going to teach them everything they need to know about life here. You're going to teach them language, you're going to teach them culture, you're going to teach them religion, you're going to teach them how to act in the court, you're going to teach them everything they need to do to live as workers for our government. We're going to take these Jews who hate us, and we're going to make them loyal to us. We're going to teach them everything they need. And that was Daniel, along with, we don't know how many others. They were educated in the ways of Babylon. And for the next 70 years, they lived there. And by the time we get to this place in Daniel chapter 6 that I mentioned a moment ago, it is now 539 BC. Maybe a little bit into 538. We're not sure, again, exactly the framework here. All right? But we know in 539 is when Belshazzar dies in chapter 5, verse 30, and Darius the Mede becomes the king. And this is after Darius the Mede is the king, so sometime after 539. Daniel has lived in Babylon for 65 years, at least. He's now 80 years old. He's been all the way back in the beginning of Daniel, he was at the very highest reaches of the civil government. Because Nebuchadnezzar said, man, there's something different about you. You have this spirit of the divine. You have some kind of connection with the gods. And I like people who have connection with the gods because the gods can get me what I want, and people with connections to the gods can get me what I want. He put him in this high place. And Daniel was used by God in the nation of Babylon to interpret dreams, to have this influence. And then Nebuchadnezzar dies, and somewhere along the way, apparently Daniel is forgotten. Because remember last week when Belshazzar becomes king, he has this handwriting on the wall, and he brings all his people in, all his smart guys, his religious conjurers, and all the people who are supposed to know this stuff. He tells, tell me what the handwriting on the wall means. And all of them say, yeah, we have no idea what that means. We're not sure at all. And he's fretting about, how am I going to find out? And his mom comes in, the queen mother comes in and says, there's this guy named Daniel. Way back in the days of your father. Probably your grandfather, your ancestor. Remember, the word father means ancestor. There's this guy named Daniel, and he's done this before. I think he's your guy. And he calls Daniel in. Now, why does he have to call Daniel in? And the answer is because somewhere along the way, Daniel went from this position of authority and influence and kind of fell off the map. Maybe with the change of kings, the king wanted to bring his own people in. And Daniel's kind of disappeared from public life. And the queen mother comes in and says, hey, I got your guy. You just need to get him here. And Daniel comes in, and the king tells Daniel, listen, if you can interpret this handwriting on the wall, I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom. Why third? Because there was a king, Nabonidus, and there was his Belshazzar, who was the second under his father, Nabonidus. And so the highest he could get was a third. He was so desperate, he said, I'll give you everything I can possibly give you. And Daniel says, you can keep it. But I'll tell you what it means. Your days are numbered. God's weighed you in the balances and you found wanting. Your kingdom's going to be divided. And that night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, is slain. That night. It's all over. That whole third in the kingdom thing wasn't that big a deal in the kingdom that doesn't exist anymore. But Daniel's come back to public life, and now at 80 years old, Darius the Mede becomes king. He divides the kingdom up. He said, look, we got to have some regions to govern this thing because this is too big. Let's divide up. So he puts 120 satraps, 120 kind of regional governors probably. And over the 120, there's 3 who are kind of gonna be you have the king, you're gonna have these 3, and then you have 120 under them. And Daniel's one of those 3. Daniel's come back to public life, and Daniel begins in verse number 3 to distinguish himself. He possessed an extraordinary spirit. In fact, it was so extraordinary that the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Some of you have maybe been in a workplace where the competition is heating up a little bit. And there's a guy there who's kind of excelling, or maybe a lady there who's kind of going the extra mile and making everybody else mad. And I was saying, man, we got to stop that person. The idea isn't let's see how we can get better. The idea is let's make sure we bring them down. And they began to look, these people who didn't like Daniel, they began to look for every possible way that they could make an accusation against Daniel. This is how you know Daniel wasn't a politician. Verse number 4, they found no ground of accusation, no evidence of corruption. This guy is clearly unqualified for the job. He doesn't know how to work the system. No, actually, I think it's entirely different. I think Daniel's character was such, I think Daniel's integrity was such, that in his public life, his commitment to God, to honesty, to integrity, to what it meant to be a child of God showed up. Here's the reality. Your commitment to God is clearly seen in your daily life. Your commitment to God is clearly seen in your daily life. Now, I confess to you, that's not the way I originally wrote that sentence. I originally wrote that sentence this way. Your commitment to God should be clearly seen in your daily life. And that's the wrong way to put it. You know why? Because your commitment to God is seen. And what is seen may be that your commitment to God isn't that high. But your commitments are seen in the things you do. It shows up in your daily life. Why was it that Daniel showed this extraordinary spirit? The answer is because, like so many times before, as it says earlier, Daniel was known to have this connection with the divine. You got a connection with the gods. There's something different about you. How little did they know what was actually different? Because he was not serving a king of this world. Daniel had this extraordinary spirit, and it showed up in everything he did. It set him apart. So many people today live life with this attitude. I used to call my grandpa. He's passed away now. But I remember calling him and saying, "Hey, Grandpa, what you doing?" He's like, "The least I can get away with." He was retired. He'd lived life in a coal mine for years, and then was building manager for a bank. He was retired. He was allowed to do the least he could get away with. Of course, the least he'd get away with was tinker in the shop all day and build stuff and drive all over, take trips, all that stuff you dream of doing. But you know what? Too many people today in their Christian life, what are they doing? The least they can get away with. There's no radical commitment. I don't want to say there's no radical commitment. Let me back up. For many people, I fear we don't have a radical commitment to following Jesus. We're trying to do the least we can get away with. We've developed a form of modern Christianity that's the very least. We've dumbed it down. And again, somebody right now is, "Oh, I can't believe he's saying this publicly." Just wait. But I want to challenge us because here is what is so striking to me about this. Daniel, hundreds of miles away from him, he's never going back to Palestine. He's never going back to Israel. I do not think, I don't think Daniel was part of the return. Here's what I think. I think Daniel was so committed to God that for 65 years, hundreds of miles away from his family, he was going to live a certain way. He didn't think, nobody over here knows me. God abandoned me. God, if you couldn't keep me over there at home, why should I serve you over here? For Daniel, the answer was, I'm going to serve you over here because this is where you have me right now. This is what I'm doing. Daniel did not partake of the easiest way out. The other thing my grandpa would say sometimes, what are you doing? He's like, "I'm just loafing." Now, you know what that means? Again, too many of us, we're just loafing through life. We're sitting around trying to do the least possible. I think to some degree, maybe our modern approach to Christianity is driven by our modern approach to outreach. If the goal is, let's get as many people as possible to do something, we're gonna change things. And here's my challenge for us. If your goal in following Jesus is the least amount possible, you will never pick up a cross and carry it. You're never going to do it. You know why? Because crosses are heavy. I mean, it's not the little thing you wear around your neck. It's something they crucify you on. And when Jesus came and he challenged his disciples, he said, if you want to come after me, you're going to need to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. In other words, he says, if you're going to come after me, you're going to actually have to come after me. And I fear that so many times we have dumbed down what it means to be radically committed to Christ because we're scared of driving people off. Maybe we're scared that if we raise the bar too high, people are going to float away. They're not going to come back for that. They're not going to show up. Hey, I want people here. Okay? I'm glad you're here this morning. I really am. I hope you'll come back next week. We'll do this again. In fact, we do this every week. Why? Because I believe God's called us to get together to sing and read the scriptures and pray together and preach the word and respond to Him. I think God's called us to do this. But what has to drive us here? What has to drive us here is not the least common denominator. It has to be a sense that we are radically committed to following Jesus, even if that costs us something. Here's Daniel, and everybody around Daniel says, there is not one hint. This guy is so radically committed. We're not going to find anything wrong with him. We're not going to find a piece of paper out of order. In fact, he's so radically committed, they say if we're going to find something against Daniel, it's going to have to be in his religion. We're going to have to create a problem. How many ever seen The Music Man? I'm totally drawing a blank on that one. He's a what? He's a music man. And he goes into this town of River City and he says, what's the biggest problem? Oh, we don't have any problems here. So, what do we have to do? We got to create a problem. And what's the problem he creates? You're obviously unfamiliar with the problems created by a pool table in your town. That's why there's trouble in River City. Still drawing a blank? Anybody? Missed you all on that one. There's trouble. He went to create trouble, and because he wanted to sell something. And if you want to sell something, you got to create a need for it. And all right. Here's what happened. We have to create a problem for Daniel. We got to create. There's no trouble with Daniel. If we're going to have a problem with Daniel, we're going to have to create a problem for Daniel. And here's the answer. We're going to create a problem with Daniel. It's going to be because he's so radically committed to God. We got to create the problem there. And they go to the king and say, King, I got this idea for you. Why don't you make a decree that nobody can pray to anybody but you for 30 days? And in fact, let's do it this way. Let's make this like the law of the Medes and the Persians. And the law of the Medes and the Persians means you can't change it. Once you sign it, it's a done deal. And I don't know what Darius thought. Probably thought, yeah, why not? Everybody praying to me? That'd be pretty cool. Let's do it. What he didn't know was there was something going on behind the scenes. That all these people who didn't like Daniel had gotten together and said, hey, if we're going to get Daniel, it's going to be in respect to his religion. And so here's what we'll do. We'll get the king to say nobody can pray to anybody but the king for 30 days. And you know why they knew this was going to get Daniel? Because they knew Daniel's commitment. They knew Daniel had this habit of praying to God. And they said, if we're going to get Daniel, this is going to be where it's at. And so if we can get this law signed by the king, then we can use the law to get Daniel. But we know the king likes Daniel. And so we can't just have the king declare this to be the case. We have to get him to sign the law like the law of the Medes and the Persians, which can't be changed, because they suspected that if the king knew what they were really doing, he would never do it because he liked Daniel. And so, in verse number 9, the king signed the document. He signed the document. What was about to happen? What you're about to see is how serious Daniel was. What would it be for us if our commitment to God was challenged this way? What would it be? Let's see how the story plays out. Daniel, verse number 10. He knew that the document was signed. Daniel was well aware of what was going on in the culture around him. He knew the document was signed. He entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open towards Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks to God as he had been doing previously. See, Daniel had this habit that dated all the way back to the time of Solomon. When Solomon dedicates the temple in 1 Kings chapter 80, he talks about when his people sin against you. There's no man who does not sin, he says. As you're angry with them, you deliver them to an enemy, so they take them away captive to the land of an enemy far off or near. That was the Babylonian captivity, 1 Kings chapter 8. Solomon, probably about 400 years before this, Solomon says one day this is going to happen. And when you take them away, if they take thought in the land where they have been taken captive and repent and make supplication to you in the land of those who have taken them captive, say, we have sinned, we've committed iniquity, we've acted wickedly. If they return to you with all their heart, with all their soul in the land of their enemies who have taken them captive, and they pray to you toward their land which you have given their fathers, the city which you have chosen, the house which I have built for your name, then hear their prayer. See, all back in time of Solomon said, hey, when you take this people captive, you take them to a faraway land, when they pray back towards the city of Jerusalem, back to the place where you have put your name, hear their prayer. Why was Daniel doing this? Because years ago, he had read this. He knew what Solomon had said. And the issue wasn't the direction of his prayer. It's not like God was only one place, and if you don't pray just the right direction, you don't have to go home and figure out which way the city is or which way the church is. God can hear your prayer wherever. But there was something very symbolic about this, because Jerusalem was a place that God had placed his name. Jerusalem was the place of the temple of God. Jerusalem was a place of the ark of God. Jerusalem was a place where God had placed himself for his people. And all the Jews were required to go to Jerusalem to worship him. And from far off, Daniel says, I can't go there, but I can look that way. I can pray that way. And every day he would open his windows, he'd get on his knees and pray towards Jerusalem. Pray probably prayers of repentance for his people, prayers of confession that we'll see later in the book. He would pray to God 3 times a day. And the men knew this. And so they say, if we get Daniel, here's where we get him. We know he prays 3 times a day, so let's make a law against praying. And if we make a law against praying, we'll get him. Some of you're thinking, well, I get all that. Here's what Daniel should do. Here's what Daniel should have done. Just keep your daggum windows closed. Right? Why open the windows? Come on. Pray silently. Pray quietly. Do it once a day. Do it in the dark. You don't have to make a big scene about it. How many of you would be tempted to do that? You don't have to raise your hand. Because probably all of us would raise our hands if we're honest, right? At some point in our life, we've been faced with the temptation to compromise a spiritual commitment for the acceptance or approval of somebody else. We've been tempted to compromise a spiritual commitment so as not to upset somebody. I have. Not only have I been tempted to do it, I've actually done it. You know why? Because I'm kind of a chicken sometimes. I'm kind of a go along, get along kind of guy. Sometimes, believe it or not, it's hard for me to kind of rock the boat. I'm a nice guy. I know some of you don't believe that. It's because you don't know me yet. I don't like conflict. So I'd be like, Daniel, let's just keep the windows closed. You can still pray, just do it quietly. Just do it silently. After all, God doesn't need you to voice your prayers. You can just think them because God knows the thoughts of your mind. God doesn't need the windows open so he can see you. God knows what you're doing. He can see right through that attic roof. Daniel, there's all kinds of ways you could go along to get along. There's all kinds of ways you could avoid the conflict. Daniel, you're not standing in front of a huge gold statue. You're not like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were surrounded by thousands of people. This is just you. Use your head, Daniel. Don't do something stupid and get yourself in trouble. What would have happened if Daniel had done that? Would God have heard his prayers? Can God hear prayers behind a closed window? Sure he can. Can God hear the prayers of somebody who's facing Asia instead of Jerusalem? Sure. Can God hear the prayers of somebody facing the North Pole instead of... Of course he can. You see, the problem wasn't a limit on God. The problem was whether or not Daniel was going to hide his religious commitments in order to avoid problems. Was there anything that required Daniel to pray 3 times a day towards Jerusalem? As I've studied the scriptures and searched for it, I don't think there's any requirement for it. I think there was a pattern, but I think there were a great many godly believers who probably didn't pray 3 times a day facing Jerusalem from an attic window. But Daniel, in his conscience, in his commitment to God, Daniel said, I have to do it this way. And in that moment of conflict, in that moment of decision, what's going to happen if all of a sudden Daniel doesn't pray anymore publicly? What if Daniel just does it privately? You ever thought about that? What if Daniel says, 30 days, I can keep my windows closed for 30 days. In 30 days, I'll start right back up. But what would he have said to everybody around him if he stops praying publicly for 30 days? What would he have said to them? You win. My pleasing you, my avoiding problems is more important than my following my conscience before God. Now, sometimes we don't think about it that way. Why? Because we've managed to justify it. We've managed to kind of figure out a way to go along to get along. But here's the challenge for us. What's it going to be for you? What's it going to be for us? Listen, nobody here is passing a decree that you can't pray to God for the next 30 days. Nobody's doing that. Our problems don't look like this. And in fact, your results are not going to be Daniel's. Yeah, so we go on. These men came by agreement. They found Daniel making petition, supplication before his God, verse number 11. They did. He was doing exactly what they knew he would do. They approached, they spoke to the king. Hey, king, didn't you sign this injunction? Anyone who makes a petition to pray to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days be cast in the lion's den? Didn't you do this? Yeah, I did that. The statement's true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you have signed, but he keeps making this petition 3 times a day. They found the ground of accusation, as they said, in respect to his God. Couldn't find anything else. The king, as soon as he heard this statement, he was deeply distressed, and he set his mind on delivering Daniel. Even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. We got to figure out some way to get out of this. You know why they made this big deal? This has to be the law of the Medes and Persians. It can never be changed. You know why? Because they knew if the king knew it was Daniel, Daniel was safe. If we tell him we're trying to get rid of Daniel, he'll get rid of us because he likes Daniel. And if we don't sign a particular kind of law, the king will find some way around it. But the law of the Medes and the Persians, according to the culture and the law of that time, could not be changed. Not even the king. The very thing that was designed to give the king authority is the very thing that took the king's authority away from him. King, you have the authority, make this decree. And by making that decree, he lost his authority to save Daniel. Had no way about it. And so they take Daniel in verse number 16. The king gave orders. Daniel was brought and cast into the lion's den. I don't know what it looked like. I know growing up you see the pictures of some pit in the ground with like a wall around it, and they throw Daniel down in there, and they got this stone. I don't know if it was like that or not. I rather imagine it was some kind of caged-in area, maybe a house or a building of some sort, with a bunch of lions in there who don't get fed very often. And they brought him in, and the king says to Daniel, verse number 16, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." What was the king saying? I can't help you with this one. Your God has to help you. I am not of the same level of authority that your God is. Your God is a higher king, and he's going to have to help you out of this one. I don't know what Daniel thought at this time. You think Daniel had some second thoughts? Man, I should have kept the windows closed. It was only 30 days. They weren't telling me I couldn't pray privately. I could have done all this kind of behind the scenes. I don't know what Daniel thought. But I know what Daniel did. He prayed. Because that was his commitment to God. And then he spent the night in the lion's den. They throw him in there. The stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and the signet ring was a noble price, some kind of wax stamp, not designed to lock it, but designed to prove that it hadn't been opened. That once those seals are broken, it's kind of like you go to the grocery store and you buy something. I'm told this. I don't know. I don't go to the grocery store and I don't buy stuff there and I don't cook. But they have those seals on them, that show it hasn't been opened yet. You ever open a pop and it kind of you hear that little psst, right? Reminds you it hadn't been opened yet. Right. The seal was like that, designed to prove that it hadn't been opened. And the king went off to his palace, verse 18. He spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. The king, the most powerful man, could do nothing. Couldn't even sleep. All night long, he's awake. No entertainment, no musicians, no nothing comes in. He is distraught. King arose at dawn at the break of day, went in haste to the lions, and he came near to the den to Daniel. He cried with a troubled voice. He said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you constantly serve been able to deliver you?" He says, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him. Innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I've committed no crime. I haven't done anything wrong." The king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of his den. And so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he had trusted in his God. The king gave orders. He brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. I think that's where the image of this pit in the ground comes from. As soon as they throw them in, the lions are going to town. They haven't eaten all night long. Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, men of every language who were living in the land, saying, "May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. His kingdom is the one that will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." God delivered Daniel. Isn't it a great story? Don't you love the way it ends? Every single one of us, knowing the end of the story, we'd say, "Oh yeah, I'd absolutely do that, because I know how it ends." Here's the hard part for us. Is when it comes time for you, day to day and week to week, to make choices about living out your spiritual commitments, you don't know how the story ends. I mean, you know how it ends at the end, right? Whole Bible in 2 words, what is it? God wins, right? We know that part of it. It's the 50 or 60 years between now and then, right? Between now and the time we die. That's the part we're worried about. We're perfectly fine for God to win in the end as long as we can win now. God, I'm willing to follow you radically as long as it doesn't cost me too much. God, I'm willing to do whatever you call me to do as long as it's not that. And I don't know what that is for you. I don't know where your commitment is tested. I don't know where your spiritual commitments are finding themselves challenged. It's probably not here. Here's what I love Hebrews 11. The Hall of Faith chapter, right? You've read it before about all these people who indicated faith. And let me just read a few verses, beginning at verse number 33. It talks about these people who by faith conquered kings. They performed acts of righteousness. They obtained promises. They shut the mouths of lions. That's Daniel probably. They quenched the power of fire. They escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness they were made strong. They became mighty in war. They put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. What a great story. Every single one of us, we want to be there, right? We want to be those kind of radically committed followers of God who have all these great things happen. But the passage doesn't stop there. Listen to the rest of it. Others were tortured, not accepting their release. They didn't look for a way out. They didn't keep the windows closed. They did it so they might obtain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings. Yes, chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. Ouch. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins, goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. See, everybody likes the first part of that. The victors, the conquering heroes, the ones who have all these good things, and then we get second, wait a minute, tortured? Sawn in two? Put to death with the sword? Destitute? Afflicted? Wandering in deserts? You know what? Sometimes those who serve God faithfully receive good things quickly. And sometimes those who serve God faithfully die. And sometimes those who serve God faithfully don't even die. They suffer. We get mistreated, perhaps. Maybe you lose a job because of your Christian integrity. You refuse to sell at any cost to a customer, you might lose your job. You might risk a promotion by your insistence on keeping your Christian principles. The Apostle Paul knew a thing or two about that. He said, "We do not lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, our inner man is being renewed day by day, for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison." This is momentary light affliction. Listen, if you knew about the life of the Apostle Paul, it's hard to imagine how you call that momentary and light. He was a man of immense suffering, who paid a huge price until he died. Maybe twice, we don't know. They stoned him. 5 times they beat him. 39 times. He was hungry. He was destitute. He was shipwrecked. For years, he said, it's momentary and light. Not worthy to be compared with the glory that's to be revealed in us. Only a sense of eternity can create that in us. Only a sense of the supremacy of God can bring that out of us. You live out your Christian commitments, you're not guaranteed to be spared from the lion's den. The king said, "Oh, Daniel, I know your God will preserve you from this," but what's the first question he asks? Daniel, did your God preserve you from this? Who would have been in charge if Daniel hadn't been able to answer that because Daniel's dead? God. If God had let Daniel die in the lion's den, you know who's God? God. Daniel was not owed a free pass in the lion's den because he was faithful to God. You read in Hebrews 11:1, so many people did not get that. But God in His providence did it for Daniel. But many others didn't get it. If you are committed to Christian principles because you think God is always going to give you immediate blessings, you're going to be quickly disappointed. But radical Christianity doesn't say, I'm going to follow you as long as you do it now. Radical Christianity says, I'll take up my cross and I'll follow you. And whatever it costs me, it costs me. Whatever happens to me, it's not as bad as what happened to you on the cross. Whatever you bring into my life, I will embrace it with joy because the sufferings of this present age are not worthy to be compared with the glories to be revealed in us. Do not sell eternity for the present. Yeah, Daniel could have prayed with the windows closed. But no, he couldn't have. Because his conscience before God said, I got to follow God no matter what. What does this look like for us today? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. Christian culture seems to be increasingly antagonistic. We see Christian truth that is greeted with hostility, with threats. There are certain kinds of sins that we're not permitted to speak about publicly. Certain things we're not allowed to say. Certain claims we're not allowed to make. You speak out against the public sins of this age. You speak out against the sins of abortion. You're considered hateful. You speak out against the sins of homosexuality. You're considered bigoted. You speak out about truth and honesty. You speak out about commitments of materialism and how we live our lives in this world. It's a whole different group that threatens us. Here's the thing. Most of us aren't living there. Where does this touch our lives? There's been no law passed that you can't pray. Oh, what about prayer in schools? I don't think that's a good one. As somebody once said, so long as there are tests, there will be prayer in schools. What about taking the 10 Commandments out of the courtroom? I won't even put the nativity scene up on the city hall anymore. I don't think that's really big threats to Christianity. I know maybe somebody like, I can't believe you just said that publicly. I don't think that's our big battle. Listen, I don't think that we're going to have a great outbreak of revival because we got 10 Commandments hanging in courtrooms. They've been hanging there for decades, and it hasn't changed it. I don't think the hope for the salvation of souls is a nativity scene on the courthouse lawn. I don't think that's where it's at. And I don't think that's what we're fighting against. You see, the challenges for most of us aren't in the big public arenas. It's in your daily personal life. It's the choice between indulging the sins of the flesh or fleeing the sins of the flesh. It's about whether you will trade your relationship with God for a few minutes of pleasure in this world. It's about whether you're willing to risk a relationship to talk to somebody about the gospel of Jesus Christ and the love of Christ for them. It's about whether or not you're willing to stand for your Christian principles when somebody around you is urging you to compromise just one time, just a little bit. Come on, don't be so rigid. Keep your windows closed. That's all you have to do. When Daniel heard about the law forbidding his prayer, he didn't rally the troops. He didn't get all the fellow Jews to go, let's form a mob on the steps of the palace. You know what he did? He prepared himself for death to keep his commitments. We must live our lives according to the radical pattern of Scripture, not the pattern of the world. We show our godliness by the way that we live. Our commitment to God shows up day after day. Listen, God calls some to win by living. He calls others to win by dying. But in life or death, God rules, and we're called to serve Him. The question for most of us isn't, will I die for Christ? The question is, will you live for Him? In the easy decisions, most of us, push comes to shove, and the big decisions, we're going to do the right thing. It's the little ones that get us. It's the little ones, it's only a little one, it's only private, but in those moments, our radical commitment to Christianity has slipped. In Matthew 10:28, Jesus said, "Do not fear those who are able to kill the body, but not able to kill the soul. Rather fear Him who is able to destroy both the soul and body in hell." Why did Daniel pray? It's because he was fearing the one who could kill both the body and the soul. Being eaten by lions was nothing compared to facing God. Oh, death, where's your victory? Oh, death, where's your sting? It's gone. Death is swallowed up in victory. The resurrected power of Jesus Christ gives us a new way to look at conflict in this world. And say, I'm living for something else. I'm not living for now. You want to take something away from me for that? Have it. I'm following Christ. I don't know what that's going to look like in the years to come. I don't know what that's going to look like for us as a church. I don't know what that's going to look like for me as an individual believer, as a pastor. I don't know what's going to look like for you as a teacher or a salesman or a businessman or a nurse or a manager. I don't know what that looks like for you in the future. But don't wait to find out. The time to now is to say, God, I'm going to follow you radically. Long before there are laws, I'm making up my mind. This is where I stand. This is what you've called me to do. The issues of conscience, listen, I don't know where that is for you. But search the Scriptures and determine, I'm going to live by them. And when the day comes to pay the price for that, I'll embrace it and I'll trust God with the outcome. Again, it's not the big things that are going to get you. It's the little things day by day by day. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. Make the commitment now. If it's lions, it's lions. We live in a blessed place. Today, as we meet here in public, there are places that don't meet in public. As we pray together out loud, there are churches that gather in secret to worship and to preach. Today, there's congregations that are being led by men who bear the scars of prison. And we think we had it bad because we had to get up a little bit early this morning for Sunday school. Don't soften Christianity. Live a radical commitment to God. Let the culture do what it will do. But let us say, I'm going to keep praying with windows wide open because God has called me to live radically for Him. When the day comes we pay the price for that, let's embrace it. But embrace it by faithful, committed living to Christ. Our musicians are going to come, and as we close this morning, we're going to sing to 1,000 generations. God is King, not just 2,500 years ago. He still is. Let's rest in Him and rejoice in that. Let's pray together. Father, give us a heart of commitment to You. Give us a heart that says, I will follow You. I will keep the commitments that Scripture requires of me. And when the day comes that we face difficulty for that, may we face it with joy because we know that we have a greater inheritance. And should the day comes that requires of us danger, may we embrace it. But until then, in the little things, help us to live faithfully to the commitments You've called us to. In the name of Jesus, I pray.